Another wave of atrocities in Ethiopia's Tigray region. Thousands flee their homes after attacks by troops. Months of violence have forced the Biden administration to impose restrictions on its longtime ally. But can that end what rights groups are calling ethnic cleansing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. He was hailed by many after he won the Nobel Prize in 2019 for his work in ending decades of conflict with neighboring Eritrea. But just a year later, President Abiy Ahmed's reputation was tarnished by war and discrimination. Ethiopian troops, backed by newfound ally Eritrea, launched a military offensive in Tigray against a regional group controlling the region. Thousands were killed in the crackdown in November, and more than 2 million people fled their homes. But even after claiming victory, accusations of atrocities committed by President Abiy's forces continue. The UN is warning of a famine after crops were destroyed and livestock slaughtered. And the pandemic has only worsened the plight of the displaced. Ethiopia has come under increasing pressure from the international community over the mounting violence in Tigray. And now the U.S. has imposed travel restrictions and cut security assistance to its oldest ally in Africa. Ethiopia is accusing Washington of meddling in its internal affairs.
The
restrictions imposed by Washington did not take into account the friendship between us for 120 years. It will not only harm bilateral relations, but also lead to instability in the Horn of Africa and impact the fight against terrorism. In 1956, Ethiopia helped the U.S. fight North Korea, and recently, it helped in the fight against terrorism. Ethiopia's role in peacekeeping is great, and these restrictions will hamper those efforts. Ethiopia's sovereignty is not negotiable, and we call on Washington to reconsider its decision.
Thousands of those displaced from Tigray have taken refuge in neighboring Sudan. With the Abiy government enforcing a media clampdown, Al Jazeera's Hiba Morgan has been monitoring events from Sudan's capital, Khartoum.
It's been more than 6 months since conflict began in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region, but reports of ethnic targeting of Tigrayans continue. This time, ethnic Tigrayans in the towns of Shire say hundreds of displaced people were rounded up from camps by Ethiopian and Eritrean troops and taken to unknown locations with fears that some of them could have been killed. Now, the conflict started in November between the Ethiopian government and the regional Tigray People's Liberation Front, and it's left thousands killed and more than 1 million internally displaced, with at least 70,000 fleeing to neighboring Sudan to the eastern states of Kassala and Gadaref. Al Jazeera has spoken to refugees in those states who say that for them to be able to flee from any danger from the Ethiopian government troops as well as Eritrean troops, they had to claim some other forms of ethnicity. The U.S. has reported what's happening in Tigray as ethnic cleansing, and human rights groups have said that atrocities have been committed by both sides. Now, the U.S. has imposed visa restrictions on certain individuals as well as sanctions because of the conflict in the Tigray region, and has repeatedly called on the withdrawal of Eritrean troops by the Ethiopian government. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has also called the conflict in the Tigray region stressful and said that he also wants to see it come to an end. But refugees and displaced people now say that the Eritrean troops continue to be present in the town of Tigray and continue to commit atrocities. Hiba Morgan for Inside Story, Khartoum.
All right, let's take a closer look at what started this unrest. Tigray is a semi-autonomous area in Ethiopia's north governed by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It's estimated to have up to 250,000 fighters. It was the front line for Ethiopia during its 2-year conflict with Eritrea, and large amounts of military equipment are still stored there. Despite ethnic Tigrayans only making up 5% of the population, they controlled the national government for nearly 3 decades. That's before Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018. That led to tension when Tigray's leaders twice defied Ahmed's government, once by refusing to join his coalition, and again last September by holding elections against the orders of the central government. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Addis Ababa, Samuel Gerechu is a journalist. In Oslo, Goitom Gebreluel is political analyst and researcher focusing on the Horn of Africa. In Washington, D.C., William Lawrence is former U.S. diplomat and professor of international relations at American University. A warm welcome to you all. Samuel, let me start with you today. Ethiopian diplomats have said that if Washington implements these measures, Ethiopia will impose restrictions on visas for American officials. How is all of this going to impact the Ethiopia-U.S. relationship?
Let me begin by, first of all, saying thank you for inviting me. Sanctions has never worked most of the countries that has been sanctioned by the U.S. The Ethiopian side is reacting to what's been happening, or the discussion that's taking place in Washington, D.C. with the Biden administration. But you have to appreciate the fact that what has truly changed Ethiopia is the foreign investment that has been coming to Ethiopia. Beyond the visa restrictions, there's an assumption that everyone wants to go to the U.S. It might as well be, but if that's the punishment they're entertaining, I don't think the elites of Ethiopia really would suffer if you restrict their visas or from going to the U.S. What worries us the most is how much it will affect the foreign investment that's happening in Ethiopia. As you know, in the last 2 weeks, the Ethiopian government decided to invite foreign investment to the country, including Vodacom, that has pledged to invest $850 million to the local Ethiopian telecom sector. And there's a discussion that this restriction or sanction might really affect the kinds of investment Ethiopia really needs. What has truly changed Ethiopia in the last, many years is the fact that foreign investment was coming to the country. And that's what is really concerning to many people. But whether you restrict an official from going to the U.S., it's an assumption that everyone wants to go to the U.S. And it's a wrong assumption.
William, from your vantage point there in Washington, D.C., how unusual is it and how significant is it that the U.S. would take a step like this against one of its key allies in Africa?
It's quite unusual, and while I would disagree that sanctions are always ineffective, they actually can be quite effective, as we saw, for example, recently in Libya, the use of sanctions to help get key players to the negotiating table. I think that the way this was done was sort of ham-handed, in that Secretary Blinken announced blanket sanctions for a wide array of political figures in Ethiopia and even their families without naming anyone in particular, and also announced economic sanctions and then a bunch of exceptions without naming what they actually were. And this is one of the ways in which sanctions go wrong, in that if they're not targeted enough on actual people that you're trying to get to respond to them in a certain way, they engender the very type of nationalistic response that we're seeing right now ahead of the Ethiopian elections and in the midst of a civil war, which is quite popular with most Ethiopians, or a war effort that's quite popular with them. I really think has the potential to backfire. I know that Secretary Blinken knew that action had to be taken to try to bring about humanitarian intervention, corridors and all that, and negotiations to bring about an end to the conflict. But I don't think it was handled in a way that will be particularly effective at this point.
Goitom, Ethiopia's foreign ministry has said that if U.S. restrictions continued, Ethiopia would be forced to reassess its relations with the U.S., which might have implications beyond our bilateral relations. And some analysts take that to be a thinly veiled threat. My question to you, could all of this impact Ethiopia's role as an intelligence partner monitoring armed groups in the Horn of Africa?
Unlikely, because Ethiopia's power and influence in the region has been significantly decreasing over the last 2 or 3 years because of the misadministration by this government. They've gone to war with Sudan. They've, decimated their army in Ethiopia. The economy is in shambles. Because of their internal conflicts, they've had to pull back some of their troops from Somalia. Because of the conflict with Sudan, Sudan wants to change the peacekeeping force in Abiy, and overall, the role of Ethiopia as a stabilizing force in Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa, was based on the circumstances of the past. And those were fairly stable domestic conditions, relatively good relations with neighbors, and a foreign policy of restraint in the region that relied on primarily diplomacy. Once all of that is gone, Ethiopia does not have that leverage anymore, and it doesn't. It's now even a threat to the region. In addition to that, I would disagree with some of the things that my colleagues just said. In terms of the sanctions, we have to remember that they came 7 months after mass rape, ethnic cleansing, starvation crimes, mass murder. The U.S. has been trying so hard to avoid this ending up on this collusion course with the Ethiopian government. But the Ethiopian government, led by Abiy Ahmed, has insisted on its right to commit a genocide, and it doesn't have that right. And in fact, the world has a responsibility to intervene. And I think they've been extremely soft on Ethiopia, given all the crimes that they have been engaging in, and given the fact that it took them almost 7 months to take these measures.
Samuel, obviously this is being interpreted as a big rebuke to Prime Minister Abiy. What does all of this mean with regard to his future? And is he feeling a lot of pressure right now? Is he concerned?
I think the pressure is coming from all sides. It's not just the U.S. It's also among Ethiopians. He won the Nobel Peace Prize not too long ago, and the expectation of a Nobel Peace Prize is much higher than, a regular African president, for example. But there's an election that's happening in a few weeks in Ethiopia, and many people are voicing their opinions. It's going to be, it's an open secret if it is going to be a true democracy that he promised 3 years ago. But the fact is, what's happening in Tigray, I have to highlight, is really, really sad for many of us. You don't have to be from the region. You don't have to be, I echo what's been said, including the UN. Many people are being affected. You only have to speak to the victims that are going to the Sudan. But ultimately, what's affecting is not just the Prime Minister's future. I think it's also affecting the image of Ethiopia, a country that was on the move, a country that was welcoming foreign investment. Sanctioned by whether it's going to be effective or not. Ethiopia, the dominant actor in Ethiopia at the moment is China, for example. Whether the U.S. decides to take its aid money away, at the end, I think Ethiopia will ultimately survive. But ultimately, what worries me and what worries lots of people is not just the future of Prime Minister. I think it's the country, Ethiopia. We want Ethiopia to be, self-sufficient. We want more peace. We've gone through all kinds of conflicts. The conflict is not happening just in Tigray. It's happening in all parts of the country. And that's what worries most of us when it comes to Ethiopia.
William, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that these restrictions on economic and security assistance, that essentially they're meant to push the parties that are involved in this conflict to try to settle it. Do you believe that these U.S. measures can actually put a stop to the conflict, can actually get these people into some type of dialogue or negotiation, and that it ultimately could put a stop to the suffering of so many civilians who have suffered so massively in Tigray these last several months?
So let me start by saying the reasons for the sanctions are excellent, for the reasons that your two other guests said. The atrocities being committed by all sides, but in particular by the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, are just atrocious and beyond the pale, as can be seen, as was said, among the arriving refugees in Sudan. Now, as I said, the way in which this has been rolled out, I think, has been ineffective and will have to be recalibrated. But sanctions can have the desired effect if very targeted and done properly. And the prospects for negotiation in the short term are quite low. All analysts are saying this. So most people are saying that there needs to be a step-by-step approach, starting with humanitarian assistance, starting with allowing the humanitarian organizations to talk to the Tigrayan rebels who are sort of off-grid and in rural areas now, even though there's a lot of popular support for them in Tigray because of the atrocities committed, particularly by the Eritreans. There are calls to push the Eritreans out. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon because Abiy is served by having these buffer forces encircling the Tigrayans in addition to the Ethiopian forces. And so a step-by-step process means sanctions leading to humanitarian aid, leading to local ceasefires and accommodations. And then this larger dialogue has to take place, which I agree with Samuel, has to be on the national level and sort of reimagine the Ethiopian federalism rather than focusing only on Tigray. But a direct negotiation with the Tigrayans is needed, but not likely at this point.
Goitom, I want to go back to a point that you were making a few moments ago when you were speaking about the atrocities that have been alleged to have been committed in Tigray. The UN has said that women and girls in Tigray are being subjected to sexual violence with a level of cruelty beyond comprehension. The reports that have emerged so far of rapes from the region have been absolutely horrific. How much is rape and other forms of gender-based violence being used as a tactic of war right now?
It's extreme and very extensive, but I think it's important to understand the logic of the war. This is a war on a people, and the purpose is its extermination. So sexual violence, for example, is not, the pattern that we're seeing is that we're not dealing with soldiers misbehaving. This is a systemic attempt to destroy the reproductive capacities of an entire society. Soldiers are raping women in groups as large as 20, 30, and the purpose is to destroy them physically and mentally. And this is just one form of violence that doesn't have a very, I would say, that has no military purpose at all. Another one is the destruction of cultural heritage. And of course, finally, the most important or the most devastating one is the use of famine. When you put all of this together, what you see is a systemic attempt to exterminate an entire society. So the idea that, this was a war waged on TPLF and that it was initiated by an attack on the Northern Command by the TPLF is absolutely ridiculous. If that was the case, there would be no reason to rape women, and certainly not with this nature and with this extent. They would not be burning churches and mosques that are very central to Tigrayan cultural heritage. The purpose of that is to attack Tigrayanness as such. And another thing we need to consider is that Abiy Ahmed spent 2-3 years preparing the Ethiopian population for this genocide. He spent 2-3 years, othering and demonizing Tigrayans as a whole population. Every time something happened, it was blamed on the Tigrayans. And he really sort of nurtured a racism that was present already in sections of the society. And we see that racism today also in civil society. Human rights organizations have indirectly embraced this war. Famous human rights activists such as Daniel Bakala, who's now the commissioner for human rights, is actively working to cover up the government's atrocities in Tigray and in other parts of the country. So racism is a central part of this war.
Samuel, I saw you nodding to some of what Goitom was saying, so I want to give you a chance to jump in if you wanted to react to any of that. But I also wanted to ask you, are all parties to the conflict in Tigray responsible for the atrocities that are being alleged to take place right now? And also, if things are as dire as they are being described right now after 6-7 months of conflict, how much worse could they get if this continues to go on, if it becomes a much more protracted conflict?
I echo what Goitam said in terms of the dire situation in the Tigray region. We've seen it up close. We've seen it from far. People are being affected. But I have to go back and defend Daniel Bekele. Daniel Bekele was a human rights activist who spent so many years in prison. He did not have to come. He did not need to come to the, Ethiopia to contribute. He left a very promising position from the U.S. And he's a well-exposed, respected person. Has he done enough? I don't think so. But you have to understand the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has limited resources. I don't think he wants to cover what's happening in the country. But you have to understand it has limited resources. Has it done enough when it comes to Tigray? I don't think so. But, you know, this kind of sad situations are happening everywhere in the country. I don't think Daniel has enough resources to investigate. That's why the UN wants to get involved. And that's why we should all welcome it, because we need to know exactly what happened. Again, I'm not trying to discount what's happening in the Tigray region. I echo what Goitam said. We watched it, and I believe the victims. The victims are saying the same thing. Sexual, harassment, sexual violence is happening in the Tigray region. I don't deny it. I've seen it from far, and I've seen it from being echoed by different organizations, including the one led by Daniel Bekele. But, you know, the situation in Ethiopia is overwhelming. Ethiopia has a population of almost 110 million people at the last count. The last count Ethiopia had was in 2007. It might even be much higher than 110 million. And it has limited resources. What's happening in all regions of the country. I know we're talking about Tigray. I'm not trying to discount what's happening in the Tigray region. Is overwhelmingly sad. And, you know, I grew up in an era of the Ethiopian famine. My dad was working for the Ethiopian government then as a humanitarian working for one of the NGOs. He's always told me the happenings of the country, which is truly sad. I remember in high school in Zambia and in Canada, watching the famine victims from far, and to see it happening in 2021 is overwhelmingly sad. And, the famine seems to be affecting the Tigray region once again after so many years. And again, I echo what Goitam said. Me and myself and Goitam obviously have, differences in terms of the cultural or the ethnic backgrounds we do have. But I echo what he's been saying, because what's happening in Ethiopia is, even for myself, it's just overwhelmingly sad. And to those people who've always supported Ethiopia, golly, they must be very disappointed, because too many people are dying for something that should have been prevented from the get-go.
William, let me ask you, how concerned is the U.S. about the potential for a wider regional conflict if things continue to get out of hand in Tigray? And do you believe that this has the potential to play a destabilizing role in the region?
They're very concerned. We have four different distinct armed forces from two different countries fighting in the region. We've had an armed conflict on the Sudanese border. We've had spillover effects in Somalia. We have the threat of the Egypt-Ethiopia conflict, which we're not even talking about, but which is increasingly intermingled in the international politics of this issue, and other spillover effects in the region. South Sudan, several other countries, Somalia, are all affected. In very effective reports of Somali troops involved as well. And as the crisis group, my former organization report said, Ethiopia is the linchpin of the Horn of Africa. Ethiopian stability radiates out, and Ethiopian instability radiates out. And so it's very, very important. And that's why Blinken took this dramatic action, which I think was just missed the target a little bit. But this dramatic action needed to be taken because this conflict needs to end.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave our conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Samuel Getachew, Goitam Gebreluel, and William Lawrence. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.